I think this chart behind me is one of the most important in the entire world, and it impacts my day-to-day life, and also played a key role in a breakup of mine in 2022, so let's talk about that because y'all like gossip. So up until 2022, my partner and I had mostly been in lockstep with COVID and the pandemic. We wore masks everywhere, we didn't go to risky environments, we hung outside with people, we got our vaccines together. But around that massive Omicron wave was when people kind of realized to avoid this, you would have to continue to stay very, very safe. And people didn't pass away during that big wave, so they decided, all right, well, not getting COVID, that ship has sailed. I'm just going to go back to normal. And the government started to downplay it. Businesses wanted to reopen and get butts back in seats. They wanted to get the economy going, which you'll see later didn't really work. And I saw that happening all around me, but I was reading articles on COVID, scientific studies, things about what COVID was doing to people's bodies and all the different outcomes, and realizing it was a blood vessel disease, not really a respiratory disease. And it became very clear that I was very concerned with COVID and my partner was becoming less and less concerned over time. And one of the central arguments we got into near the end was my partner asserting that it was very unlikely that we would get long COVID as young, healthy people. And that's where this chart comes in. It's called How Long Until I Get Long COVID by David Stetson on Twitter. The chart has two parts to it. The x-axis is simply how many times have you gotten COVID, and the y-axis is on any particular COVID infection, what's the chance that COVID will give you long COVID. Now, I did a deep dive on this that's linked in the video description, but most studies find that 10 to 20% of COVID infections end up in some sort of long COVID, which is lingering effects for months or years that can be anywhere from mild lingering impacts to debilitating, unable to get out of bed, life-changing side effects. This is study after study in different eras of the pandemic. The CDC has quoted 20%, World Health Organization. I also don't really trust those agencies anymore, so to me what's more impactful is the studies by researchers on long COVID just consistently turn up 10 to 20% have some kind of lingering symptoms. And so what I tried to tell my partner at the time is, I think the risk of long COVID, even for young, healthy, vaccinated people, could be 5%, it could be 10%, it could be as high as 20%. There are very few things in my life that I take a 1 in 10, 1 in 20 chance of being debilitated or having a lingering health problem. That's just not something I'm willing to do. And even more so, I'm worried about 5 and 10 years from now, if I get COVID 3 or 4 times and there's a 10% chance of long COVID, my risk would be somewhere around 30%, 1 in 3 chance I have long COVID. That's just really scary, and I'm not willing to do that. And now it's been a few years since that argument, and this is real data from Stat Canada. They found people with 3 or more infections had a 38% chance of long COVID. People with 2 infections, about 28% had lingering symptoms. And so going back to this chart, if 3 infections give you about a 38% chance of having long COVID, that puts the line we should be looking at would be somewhere in between the gray and yellow, somewhere between 10 to 20%. So what StatCan found lines up with all the other studies I've seen. We're also seeing that the majority of people, the vast majority of people in long COVID clinics had mild COVID cases. So even though severe cases might give you the highest chance of getting long COVID, most people have mild cases, and most people with long COVID had mild cases. And I personally know people in their late 20s and 30s with long COVID who didn't have any obvious, pre-existing conditions that would make them particularly vulnerable. This chart from the CDC Household Pulse Survey shows that people 50 to 59 have the highest long COVID risk, but younger people are not that much lower. Dr. Herger at Tulane finds, based on wastewater data, that the average person has had 3.5 COVID cases so far. They're getting it on average about once a year. The U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics is showing a skyrocket in the civilian labor force with a disability. I mean, just look at that massive spike around 2020. Similarly, in the UK, people who are economically inactive due to sickness, it was relatively flat, and then this is 2019, this is 2020, and it's just up since then. And I think my point is that people don't want this to be the case, and they're making ultimately an emotional decision, which emotions are very important, but people are making an emotional decision about a statistical problem and a scientific problem, and they're deciding it's not worth the effort, it's not going to happen to me, it's too much of a pain, I don't want to live like this anymore. But the scientific studies, the real world surveys of people are finding somewhere between 10 to 20% of COVID cases end up in long COVID. The new phase of the pandemic we're in is how much will this continue to eat away at all of our health and how many people are going to get long COVID one by one. People are not wearing masks. Very few people are getting the vaccines anymore even, and people are getting COVID every single year. So what is stopping people from getting COVID 10 times and having a really, really high chance of having long COVID and hundreds of millions of people having long COVID?
An estimated 1 in 10 infections results in post-COVID-19 condition, suggesting that hundreds of millions of people will need longer-term care.